Yeah, that's sort of the problem you have with as you add more features, you're obviously going to have the software become heavier and heavier and heavier. But obviously, these aren't bad features, right? Like, maybe some of them are. I'm not going to say every one of them is good, but you're naturally going to use more resources as you have more stuff. But, having fancy graphical effects, all of this stuff, like, you don't really need it, do you?
No, and there's a lot of great things. Like, my daily driver is KDE Plasma 6. And if you compare it to like version 4, it's actually pretty well tuned nowadays. But there's a lot of, fluff, like a transparent taskbar, all these, options in the settings that I never use, but somebody does because they're there.
hmm Yeah, I think you pick KDE 4. 4 is a very interesting one to pick because that's, notoriously the very, very rough release.
Yes, it was painful. I left KDE at that time because it
I
was
think a
so
lot of
bad.
people did.
Uh, the Trinity Desktop was a great drop-in then, if you've
Mhm.
heard of that.
Yes, yes. And that's I guess that sort of like sort of links into that because I saw one of the comments be like, "Hey, why don't you just go and why are you building off of KDE 1? Why not KDE 3?" It's like, well, yeah, but someone's already doing that.
They've done a pretty nice job. I used it for quite a few years, and they've polished it really nicely.
Mhm,
But it's still a pretty, heavy desktop environment even still.
mhm, mhm. I personally didn't start using KDE until Plasma 6. I've used a bit of Plasma 5 like towards I think it was 527. So it was like right towards the end of that. I don't have this nostalgia for the older versions of KDE, or I didn't start using Linux until 5, 6 years ago, something like that. So my experience is pretty much the design language that we use on the desktop really hasn't changed that much in the past 5 or so years. Like, things have been kind of polished, but there's not been any real, I guess, design revolution, I guess, is a good way to put it, right? Because if you go from the way a desktop used to look with KDE 1, the way that we design desktops, the way we design icons, the way we just designed just the structure of the applications is completely different. You can still wrap your head around what they were going for. There's still that core, you know, I look at this, I can tell it's KDE. Same with GNOME. If you look at early GNOME, you can see this is I can see how this becomes a modern version, but the way they go about it is very, very different.
The needs of people change over time.
Mhm,
I like to compare KDE 1 to modern Plasma, like jumping from Windows 2000 all the way up to, Windows 11.
mhm,
I think
mhm.
that's a pretty good comparison there.
Right, because you can even if you go back further than that, if you look back at the early versions of macOS before OS X, you can see some of that design inspiration that follows on later, even though a lot of it's changed and it's completely different in the way you interact with it. You can see how things progressed over the years, and most projects don't go through a complete I'm gonna entirely change what my target is going to be. There's obviously, with Windows, there was that brief period where they tried to do the whole mobile first thing. But besides that weird part, you can see how Windows progressed. Same thing with these Linux desktops as well, which I think is, it's really cool to see, right? You see a desktop that's been around for what? When did KDE start? Was it 98? Something like that?
Some of the code I have seen as early as 1997. I think some of it started earlier than then, but the dates in the files are earliest 1997.
hmm Right, it might have been first full release that was 98 then. That's what might be what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, yeah, I think the version 1 was released somewhere around 1998,
hmm
or one of the releases, yeah.
hmm hmm And then I believe GNOME came. I want to say GNOME came the year after that, if I recall correctly.
I think so, yeah. And it's kind of funny to bring GNOME up because, I used GNOME 1 quite a bit back in the day too, and it's very different than what GNOME is nowadays.
Mm. Well, definitely in the way. There's actually a article from a very long time GNOME developer. I think it was from like 2003. And even though the desktop has been greatly simplified since then, and a lot of the toggles that used to be there, a lot of the theming stuff that used to be there is either hidden away or completely gone. People early on, from what I can tell, this was the direction they wanted to take things. They just didn't really know how far they wanted to take it. And I guess also the needs of people back in the early 2000s, back in the late 90s, was definitely very different, right? Because people using Linux back then, for the most part, especially if we're talking before Ubuntu in 2004, most people using Linux at that point are very, very technical people, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you go, like, even before some of the early distros, if you were using Linux before something like Slackware came along, you are a very, very technical user. Even by the late 90s, getting Linux to work then was a very different experience than what it is now. Nowadays, for the most part, unless you have some weird esoteric hardware you're trying to install on like an Apple computer, for the most part, things just work.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how far we've come. I can remember having an old ThinkPad and having to write, the x86 config file out by hand because that's how things were done back then. I think, one of the biggest drivers and the changes over the years, when Linux first came out, is replacing or competing with DOS and Windows. So, everything was done on a keyboard. And then, as things like KDE came around, we went to, using keyboard and mouse. And as you progressed on to newer ones, it was more point and click. And nowadays, with newer GNOME and newer KDE versions, it's touchscreen. And so I think that design language has followed that pretty closely over the years.
I do think, I don't know. I can do a UX discussion about GNOME for a very long time because there's a lot of design changes they've made which I don't really think make sense on the desktop. I am not a fan. I've noticed them popping up in some KDE applications as well. I'm not a fan of hamburger menus. I think they are just vastly inferior way to interact with a menu than just having a menu bar. I know some developers are going to get very angry about that like they always do. I don't like them. I don't think they work on a phone either. I think there are better ways to do things there as well. Just having a pop-out list I think is just more convenient. But overall, I can see what you mean there where when especially early on, right? A lot of people designing KDE were the developers. And that's sort of a problem you have with a lot of applications where the developers are going to develop it in a way that makes sense for someone very technical or makes sense for them. If you don't have a outside guiding hand, it can be very easy to not design things specifically around the way you use something. Because you might, especially if you're using something all the time, you're going to know the pitfalls. You're going to know if I click this thing in this way, something weird's going to happen. You're going to know where the buttons are laid, out, even if they're laid out in a real weird way that doesn't make any sense. So you kind of need someone outside the developer to say, hey, do things in a sensible way. Here's a design guideline. How about we follow this?
I think that's kind of interesting because even when I sit and write an application, I'm thinking about how I'm going to use it personally.
Mm,
So I'm designing it very specifically tailored to my needs without much thought,
mm,
for anything else. But I'd like to make a note on no because
mm.
I have used it recently, sparingly. I think the biggest problem there was something simple, even for somebody more technical like me, trying to figure out where the menu was.
Right.
Something as simple as trying to save or open a file in the text editor was really difficult. There's no contrast in the default theming.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't see even how a developer or a UI designer could miss that, quite frankly. But it works for a lot of people because it's pretty popular. So it must be fine at some point.
Mm-hmm. that the thing about being popular, it's the default right now, and that's sort of why I'm interested to see what happens with. Did you see about Fedora adopting KDE as a official edition? So it's going to be both GNOME and KDE side by side.
I did see that, and I actually ran the Fedora KDE spin for quite some time to get kind of a jump on the Plasma 6 bandwagon, and it works quite well. So I'm happy to see that they are, adopting that as an official spin. I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to see how the popularity of GNOME will go, because it's sort of we're sort of repeating history now, because it started off with all of these desktops, all of these distros having KDE, and then GNOME came along, they adopt GNOME, and then over time, a lot of them ended up dropping KDE, go GNOME only, and now it's coming back once again to have both these options. And I get why KDE was dropped by a lot of them early on, like especially in the early days. There were a lot of licensing concerns with KDE, with specifically with the Qt framework, and that's, from my understanding, a big reason why GNOME came along, why GNOME got popular to begin with, because there are a lot of people concerned, well, what happens if they pull the license? What happens if they decide to not let this keep being open source? And I get it, right? I do get it.